My name is Harry Caldwell. I've been an engraver for about 9 years, and I have been recently focusing on coins. I got my start in jewelry a couple years back, but these are.
Turn the volume up, maybe?
No? I'll project. It's all good.
I got my hearing aids in, too. Turn them up.
So the demo I'm going to do today for you is a basic carving on a Mercury dime. What I'm going to be doing is putting out a border, relieving the background, texturing the whole element, and giving it a scroll, a very basic scroll that I typically use in jewelry. And a few of you have probably seen photos of this particular coin on Facebook on occasion. And Catherine, if you want to pass that book around, there's 3 or 4 examples of that particular dime inside there if you want to take a look at them firsthand. But what I'm going to start with today is an element of blanking. A lot of folks tend to, with coins, if you're starting love tokens, for instance, you'll blank the entire coin down. In this particular case, because I want to leave the image of Winged Liberty or Mercury, I'm just going to be blanking the background. Now, I've taken a couple of steps early on here to knock out some of the lettering that was around the outer rim of the coin. And I've left that little Y on the far side there, and I'm going to take that down with a round graver. This is basically just a small carbide drill bit soldered to a 3/32 brass shank. I use a round graver for blanking simply because it's less likely to gouge deep furrows like a flat might. The additional element of that is on Mercury dimes, which are the primary coin I use, they have a slight rounded element on the inside edge. And so to maintain that, the round graver is about perfect for just scraping the material away just a little bit by little bit until it's as close to flat as I can get it. Now, once those high points have been knocked down, I'll then go through with a small punch. And the punches I used these are recycled ball burrs from my days as a jeweler. Once the ball burr went dull, just took it down to a stone and took that little ball end off of it, and then flattened this down, sharpened it with about a 1200 grit paper, and rounded it off ever so slightly. That way, again, I'm not getting hard half-moon imprints on the sides of the coin. And in working with silver, that's a fairly important element to consider simply because it will mar rather quickly by comparison to steel. So these high points here, these rough spots, I'm just going to go in with this punch and very lightly knock what's remaining of those high points down. And you can tell in the silver this doesn't take much, and it's really easy to overdo it. So slow and steady tends to be the name of the game here. Now, once those are all knocked down, I'll go back in with a finer punch if I need to get into tight areas. In this one, this size punch is going to work just fine. But once those have been knocked down, then I'll go through with a secondary punch. This is more of a planishing punch. It's got a polished face. And this one's polished to about a 2000 grit. So you're at, the effective rule on this is that the harder metal, whatever surface finish you put on, it's going to be imprinted onto the metal. So if you work with a mirror finish, it'll give you a very close to a mirror finish once you're done planishing it. So again, just going over this lightly, just to take a little bit more off. And any artifacts that are left here are most likely going to be disguised by the scroll that I'm going to put in over top of them, but having a mostly uniform flat surface, or as close to uniform as you can get it, will simply allow those scrolls to read better. Okay. Now with that done, I'm going to go ahead and scribe out my border for the date. Let's see here. Well, I have my oval template right here. Oh well, we'll just draw it in. So normally I'd take about a 55-degree oval template, pop this over the top.
Hey, Howard?
Yes.
Are those dates ever important to leave on there and make it more valuable?
A lot of the coin collecting world likes to be able to easily identify what type of coin you've engraved. So leaving the date does tend to make it a bit more desirable. There are some folks that will very specifically, they'll have you work on a specific date to fill in a set that they have. And in that case, maintaining that date is absolutely essential. Clear communication between yourself and the client's always, going to answer that question whether or not they really need it or not. But any coins that I'm just doing for fun, I like to keep the collectors in mind because coin collectors are probably the bulk of the folks that are just going to be buying these off the shelf. So maintaining the date is a good thing, especially if it's a rarer date. I know there's some controversy about, do you engrave a rare coin? But, the fact is that, yes, you do engrave very rare coins on occasion because the client asks you to. At that point, just treat it like a precious metal. There's no, it has a higher intrinsic value if it's a rare coin. Of course, if you're engraving something like a three-legged buffalo nickel, don't engrave the buffalo side. That's the rare part. So, leave that side and do the other side. But yes, and leave the date and make sure you're also putting enough quality work into it that makes it, worthwhile to work on such an expensive origin coin. Okay, so I'm going to finish cutting out the background border here, and I'm using a 90 graver that's been tapered down with a 5 degree. This is using Ray Cover's sharpening templates, but I tend to find the smaller the graver, the easier it is to get the finer detail, largely just because you can see the work. Now the line I scribed there was with a standard set of dividers, and I picked that rather arbitrarily, but I wanted to make sure that the entire visage of Mercury was going to overlap those borders. That tends to make the coin look a little fuller, and that tends to be a rule with scroll as well. Just oversize it ever so slightly. I'm going to cut around the profile, doing my best not to nick the image.
You got a critic, Gary.
He must have seen my earlier chicken coins. Okay. So after I've gone over this with fairly light lines, just to make sure they're there, I'm going to go ahead and deepen these and start removing this background. So the depth of this background is going to be entirely dictated by the depth of these cuts here. I'm going to use the bottoms of the troughs as my depth gauge. I'm trying to keep these as consistently deep as possible.
How many seminars do you get a musical Keep it up, you're for lunch.
Yeah, that's our free lunch.
Okay. Okay, so now that that's been roughed out, I'm going to switch back to my round graver. That was a 90. A 90 degree taper down with a 5 degree taper to as small a point as you can get it. So again, I'm going to be cutting basically just taking off the high points here. You can still see those tiny little furrows at the bottom. And I really don't care to go past those if I can avoid it. And that'll result in a nice uniform background. I prefer the round because, again, it's not, I'm not having to deal with the corners of the flat. And if I vary those ever so slightly, I can end up cutting deeper and have to relieve the entire background again to try and get it uniform. And with tighter areas, especially in this dime, I'd rather not have to deal with the same heel drag issues with a pointed heel that I would have on a traditional flat. So once those have been knocked down, I am going to go in with a rather narrow flat to get around these edges that I can't quite reach with this round. That's going to be just... This flat's really just going to refine that plane. And I'm really not going to be removing much material with it, as you can see. As you can see, this flat's already getting a bit too big for this space. So, oh, I'm off the screen now? Thank you. There we go. Okay. Now this flat is more or less the same as the last one I was using. It's just considerably narrower. And again, this is achieved using the 5-degree sharpening template with the raised set. The difference here is also that this has a much more dramatic heel. Ray, correct me. What is the heel on?
Heel's 30 degrees on that.
30-degree heel on this one. And this dramatically cuts down on any risk of heel drag, especially in tight spaces. Okay. Okay, so going back in with a punch, I'm going to flatten out that background. One of the reasons I really like working in silver coins more so than nickel or any of the clad coins is that the material moves a lot faster. I know some folks tend to find that mushy nature of silver to be really undesirable, but for some elements like sculpting and whatnot, you can get away with a lot more in a much shorter amount of time. Now, if you really want this metal to move, you can finish this punch with a 400 grit stone or even a 260. Or in the case of inlay, I remember, Ray, you were texturing this on a file, weren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that really allowed that to grip the gold and really push it rather than squishing it around. Okay. Okay. So, with the background pretty much textured, you can either finish it, I typically finish this just with a stippling tool. You can go through and put tiny little scrolls in the background as well, which is a lot of fun, but it does take a little bit longer. So I think we'll just reserve the scrolls for the outer border on this particular one. But for that background then, just to finish that out, I'm going to use a stippling tool, which is really just, again, a small ball burr ground down to basically a pyramid point. Use about 3 facets, maybe 4. That'll help uniform that background out really nicely. And it also allows for the oxidization or the antiquing. Gives that a little bit more tooth and makes it a bit darker and much more consistent. A lot of folks in the jewelry industry find this to be a rather tedious process that they think is a waste of time, so a lot of them will go through with a heavy grit bead blaster and actually sandblast the background of some of these elements, I've noticed especially on cast rings and whatnot. And while that can certainly give a nice uniform texture, it just doesn't have the same look, and I don't think it's quite as consistent, because any artifacts from casting. Oh yes, thank you. That's a very good point.
Bead blasted finishes. I mean, the slightest little rub on that joint.
What's that?
What was the point you just made?
Oh, I'm sorry. The point Ray just made is that there's a durability factor with bead blasting as well. That the bead blasting is simply so much shallower that the minute you touch it with almost anything, it's going to leave a mar, or it's going to burnish it in an undesirable fashion. I typically find with these stippled finishes, instead of going in a linear pattern, just one line after another, if you go in a slightly circular motion, it tends to finish out a bit more evenly, and you get a much more randomized distribution of your stipples. On the stippling tool, I typically will sharpen that on a 1200 stone, but I don't think it matters that much on the stippling tool at all. I mean, it's the point, it's developing a good point that you're after rather than the surface on the facets, but this is a really nice way to pop contrast in almost anything. I use this in rings all the time. But when you're first starting on this, it's probably advisable to go around the borders of your work very slowly and, meticulously, so that you're not accidentally skipping over into an area you don't want stippled. And by leaving the center a little bit open, you can then kind of free your movements in the center to get it nice and uniform. and then use a much more reserved stroke around the edge. Just like that. Again, one of the really nice bits about silver is it tends to be a lot easier to fix than some other metals. And just to get a good close view on that. Again, just going really lightly with a planishing punch. And you'll hardly notice that in the final piece. Okay. Now, the background textured, go ahead and deal with this border here. So we already have the outer rim on this coin established. And so for this border, I'm going to do a similar sized ring on the inside here, and then cut my scroll between the two. So again, with my dividers, I'm just going to hold it in the same place and do a full rotation. Okay, so switching back to that 90. Go ahead and cut this little element here. Okay. With those roughed out, we'll go in with our divider. And for scrolls, I tend to like to use the golden mean or the golden rectangle for my proportions. And doing so, I'll use my dividers to establish the width. Go down and mark out a square. And go from one corner to the other. Oops. Is that better? Okay. So I'll go from corner to corner on that square, rotate it down. And this is going to be my mark to divide out the rest of these guys. I'm just going to walk the divider around. And as far as layout is concerned, I don't typically do a whole lot of layout with scroll aside from lightly scribing in the spine of the curl. And in this particular case, it doesn't quite matter if this ends up as a perfect 12 or 8 division because I've got something that's interrupting that flow. So whatever discrepancy in there is basically going to be hidden underneath that date. But if you're doing something, truly in the round, and you need a, full 8 divisions or 12 divisions or however many, you may have to fiddle with those widths back and forth to find that, that, what's the word I'm looking for? To find that perfect division. But let's see here. We'll go through now with a scribe. Again, this is a carbide burr that's been sharpened down and polished, slightly rounded on the end. And within our divisions there, start drawing in our scroll. I'm going to oversize these slightly so that they fill the space in as full a manner as possible. And there's a little bit of guesswork going around the, thank you. So you have to visualize where these scrolls are going to fall underneath Mercury's cap here. And you just have to be close. It doesn't need to be perfect. Unless, of course, you're going for perfect, then by all means, make it perfect. I tend to find with coins, a lot like jewelry, your time really is of the essence, and there's a certain level of good enough. Especially if you're trying to hit a lower price point. You really just need to be able to forgive yourself and own up to the fact that those little discrepancies are simply artifacts of a handmade product. Of course, commit to your client of that same fact is also a nice important element, so that they expect that. So as far as this scroll is concerned, I'm not going to do a traditional method of cutting the entire spine. I'm basically going to do a few selective elements of that spine and then remove the negative spaces to give a slightly more organic, leaf and vine element. So it actually looks like these leaves are coming straight off of the vines. So I'm going to zoom in a bit here. Still a little low. Okay. Just do a series of shallow cuts here to the rim. So again, I'm going to be leaving gaps at all the connection points, and we're effectively going to let the eye connect all these things for us. And by leaving a little bit of extra material there, you end up having, I think, personally a fuller looking scroll, but for such small spaces, it reads really nicely without magnification. And I just realized I made a mistake in my layout. Okay, so we'll be cutting these opposite. That'll be fun. So a lot of this will be cleaned up in the further steps here. Okay, so with the base scrolls laid out, I'm going to start adding a few leaves here. We're just going to go right from about that scribed line. Just arc in until the point we're touching the next one. We're really just going to be filling in. This is a lot like an English scroll on a certain level. And my process typically is to do the same types of cuts over and over again. That way you can get a certain element of repetition without, if you try to cut the entire scroll, each individual one, they all tend to be, you don't get the same uniformity in cut. So if you do the same style of cut throughout the entire piece and then repeat that over and over again, it tends to be a bit more uniform. And you're going to have moments where you simply don't cut all the way to the point you might think you should. And I tend to look at those as design opportunities. Okay. With those, we'll start removing some of the border materials here. So I'm going to knock out basically I'm going to do the bottoms of all these leaves, and then we'll do the intermediary leaves. So this is really just giving us a little bit more of a, again, playing with the negative space to get those to pop just a bit more. There we go. Yes, I am. Still using a square graver. So what I'm doing on these cuts is starting to lean them out just a little bit. And just kind of doing a scooping motion. Almost kind of a half moon cut out of these. Okay. And for these. So these intermediary leaves, you can do a few different things. You can start from the center and work out and kind of split the leaf. Or you can start from the outer edge and do more of a pointed leaf by leaning it in. And I tend to throw a bit of a variety into a lot of these, you know, just because I think it's interesting. You know, but again, there's a certain level of, you know, if you're really trying to do an exact replica on every single one, then by all means you should. But I tend to just have a lot of fun with these and try not to take it too seriously. Okay, so now once the bulk of the background's been taken out, I'll go through and just throw a few little cuts into the centers here just to give it a little bit more dynamic. Okay. Now, one element in coins that you typically do almost every time is antique them. As opposed to using liver or sulfur, I tend to use cold gun bluing. They come in these wonderful little gun blue pens, just like a Sharpie. And when they run out, you can just dip them in a bottle of the super blue, which is even more concentrated than the standard variety, and get these coins to oxidize very, very quickly.
What do you do with the super glue?
The super blue is super blue.
Not just blue, but it has to be what?
Super blue. Yeah, the standard bluing works just fine, but it takes longer for the oxides to set in. So you might end up having 2 or 3 applications rather than a single application.
Does it keep gluing afterwards? Do you have to rinse it?
It will blue in the air for a little while. I tend to stabilize these with Renaissance wax, and effectively, if there's no interaction with the air, it'll cease bluing and stays quite stable. The Renaissance wax is pretty nice just because it's a microcrystalline wax that really gets into all the nooks and crannies without leaving any kind of a visible film. So I'm wiping this with the backside of an emery cloth just to take out some of that excess bluing compound, but this is about a 600 grit cloth, and I'll just very lightly go over that to bring out some of the details. And if you start with a high quality dime, you really just end up popping the existing details that are there. You really don't have to do much to the face itself. And Renaissance wax. Well, the Renaissance wax is the last step, and I believe I left that in my truck, but that's basically just a paste wax. You just take a piece of paper towel, put a little on there, wipe it down, and then buff it with a clean cloth. And this is pretty much done.
Don't forget to sign your work.
Signing coins is one of those bits that a lot of folks have different opinions on. I tend to sign mine on the back. I know several folks like to sign theirs right on the front so that any photos of that one side of the coin always has their name on it as well. It's an equally good idea, but to each their own.
Then you have those screwballs to sign it on the rim, right?
Yes, then you have those guys.
And the collectors of them would like them signed.
Oh yes,
And
oh yes.
The club advocates it to tell modern from old.
And some folks will date the coins as well, which is really nice for reference, just to figure out where in the world that particular coin came from and what time frame.
By initial and number. So you have
And on some of the older coins, like this other one I just put up here, you'll notice the details have been worn off the Mercury head quite dramatically. And in that case, you'd probably end up going through and texturing the hair, adding some new details on the feathers and that sort of thing, just to bring it out a bit and give it a little bit more, oomph. But that's one of the reasons I like working with nicer Mercuries just from the beginning, because quite frankly, it's just one of the more beautiful American coins that I think has ever been produced. So, yeah, any questions? Well, the beauty of working from a jewelry perspective is that quick and dirty tends to win the race, and sparkle tends to take a lot of the discrepancies in the scrolls. You really just don't notice it when it's in a high polish. But as far as coin cutting is concerned, there is a certain element of speed that makes a huge difference in whether or not you're going to be making a decent amount of money on a coin or next to nothing. And charging honestly for your work is one of those tricks that I think a lot of folks think they have to price towards the bottom just to get them to sell. And I really don't believe that's a valid approach. You know, if anything, if it's not selling, double your price and see what happens. You know, and double it again and see what happens.
Amen. The perceived value applies to every market out there.
Indeed, indeed.
What does this typically go for?
A piece like this, my custom dimes tend to start at about $200. I sell these particular ones at the show for, well, right at that same price point. So 200, maybe 175 if it's a 175 or 150 if it's a blank background without a lot of detail. But if there's scroll work on the inside, it's a base price of 200 on those. And my pricing for coins for custom work is all based on size. So a dime is going to start at about 200 to 250, $50 minimum at 500, and a silver dollar is a minimum $1,000. And I've not had a problem getting custom commissions at those price points, and I'm making decent money on the coins. So but you got to know what it's worth and what time goes into it. And quite frankly, some folks are dramatically underpriced for the time they put into them. You know, I know Catherine's first couple coins, quite frankly.
You also want to use a higher grade coin when you're...
Yes, most definitely. Yeah. Yeah, using those really, really, again, the collectible variety of coins, it's like working on platinum versus gold, working on silver. You just have a higher assumed value just based on the base material.
So what's your basic per hour goal?
My per hour goal is right around $75 to $85.
I'll give you $85 for that coin.
Everybody should turn it back and toss it into the crowd like a wedding bouquet. That's
Fair enough. That would work. That would work.
That would be fun to watch. Or you can do your height. I'm over here.
Auction.
Right, there we go. No, like I said, I try and get about 85 an hour. My custom rate tends to be closer to 125 an hour because that ends up having a lot more consultation, and the meticulous nature of trying to match someone's exact drawing tends to take a lot more time than me just having fun with the coin. So,
You have price, you talk a lot.
well, exactly. That part's for free.
What's a coin like that cost without the before you engrave it, just to buy the coin?
This particular one ran $8. 1943 Philadelphia. And it's in good condition. I wouldn't consider it a top grade coin by any means, but you know, your average Mercury dime, you can pick those up in a fairly heavily worn situation for, you know, $3 to $4 without a problem. Yep.
How do the Canadian coins cut, like the loonies and toonies, are they hard to cut?
They're different metal. They're going to behave differently. I find the toonies are quite a bit of fun, but with foreign coins, you never really know what you're going to get until you start cutting into them. Some are just hard as nails. Others are, you know, very soft, and some are aluminum, and you just like I said, you just never know. So
The colors in those coins are already built into the coin that kind of help you with the design.
they can. It all depends on the design you're going after, though. So I know a lot of folks lease clad coins so they can get that copper dual tone element without having to inlay anything, but it just comes down to personal preference. I like working on precious metals, so silver coins are what I prefer. So thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it.
Okay, so I was saying I wanted to segue from what he was just saying about foreign coins, and you don't always know what you get into, clad, hard, whatever. So I want to do a little seminar. I've learned a little bit in the last few days. Long story, but I'm going to start off with, this is my father, Scott Pilkington Sr. I think a lot of y'all have seen his car over there, or rolling. We were at a restaurant one morning and somebody asked him, was he going to a car show? And I was like, no, he's a car show all by himself. My father and my mother, which is right there, Teeny, they're responsible for my engraving career. I give them great thanks for that. Anyway, I've said this before on this stage. I had a good childhood. And I was very happy when my daddy came home from Vietnam in 1969. Anyway, I was trying to figure out something cool to engrave for him. I've got several gun projects of his that are, some are going on 30 years uncompleted. Anyway, I was trying to figure out what was cool, what was appropriate. They ran a canoe rental a lot of years. You see his car over there, which his car basically is the Paradise, which is the 90th Tactical Fighter Squadron that he was in Vietnam. He was a maintenance officer. And there's the F-100s, which is the planes they flew on the car in several places. And anyway, I got to thinking, why not do a coin with F-100 on it? And then what kind of coin? Well, a hobo nickel didn't really seem right. And then I got to thinking, I've got some coins he gave me when I was a kid. So this started out life as a 20 dong 1968 South Vietnamese coin. And it's not quite done. It looks pretty good right now, but there's some things I want to do to it. And I learned some lessons. Actually, let me show you here. And I guess Daddy can see this for the first time if he wants to walk over here to the screen. Otherwise, I'm going to have to get him a magnifier. And if we tilt this just right, yeah, you can see the Paradise on the landing gear strut. But what I wanted to say, and let's see if we can see it, yeah. What I learned this morning, I bead blasted this. I hadn't seen it until I bead blasted it. You can sort of see the color variation here. And see these streaks through here? That's a 2. And that's a 0. And here somewhere, here's some more lettering. Here, oh no, here's part of the 0. That's the 2. This is the 0 for the 20 coming up through here. And this was a clad coin, and I cut it down flat. But I cut it down flat to the clad, and I did not see that until I bead blasted it this morning. And it's really apparent after I etched it with cold blue. So I've got to polish and work on that. And I wasn't happy with this discoloration here. I was planning on doing clouds in the sky up there. And because actually this was more or less the picture I started out with, which was not one of his planes. And Carolyn, raise her hand, was up in my cupola this morning talking to me. She was my muse, and we were talking about this. And I was like, yeah, I don't know what I want to do. And I pulled out this. I had this picture on Facebook of his planes, which is one of his planes with a dice down here. And I was looking at some details I was trying to put in it this morning. And she says, well, what are them things right there? They look good back there. And I'm like, well, those are the revetments that they protected the planes in from people shooting mortars or something in there. So this is just kind of an ink sketch in right there. I'm going to engrave all that in there later, and I think it'll look real cool. But anyway, this is the coin, and it's yours when I get done with it. I love you, Daddy.
Thank you. That will hang between the dice that hang down that are actually, let me think of what you call it. One of the Riviera in Las Vegas provided our unit in Vietnam their
Does he need this? Can you hear him?
canceled dice. And we got them in by the hordes, and you got one die when you were when you joined the unit, and you got your second die when you had 6 months in there. And I have a set and a bell, and this bell is another story, but the two and I put that with that right there. Now, I don't have my Suburban has got my dog tag, the only one that survived. I have 5 combat missions in the back seat of the F model,
Which that is.
which this is, and you can see the double cockpit, and 1 combat mission and an AT-37, and what was thought was an FCF was in a Cobra gunship, and we ended up going over to check the guns out, which I found out about 2 years ago was a no-fire zone. Anyway, that'll go with it. Sit up there in a primary position. I don't think I'm gonna put it in on my horns that are on there. My wife hates my cowboy horns, cattle horns. All right, well, I'm not gonna take it away from you, and what can I say?
Thank you.
It's absolutely lovely. Thank you, and I've enjoyed. I don't know how many I've been to, but I've enjoyed it.
I'm Jake Wasinski, and I am a jeweler. I've been making jewelry professionally for 20 years now, and about 6 years ago I took my first engraving class out at GRS, and I've loved it ever since, and just really love engraving and try and learn as much as I possibly can doing that. And mostly engrave jewelry, but I'm trying to expand to other stuff, a couple knives and stuff like that, and hopefully someday do a gun. And I think you should come to the Engrave In because there's so many years of experience here, and you get to pick the brains of some of the top engravers in the world, and just it's lots of fun.
Fire!
That is a tree.
Would you like marshmallow?
Oh, sure.
Might be a little hot. Oop.
Oops.
That's okay. It's tasty without the middle too. I'll toast this one. Good?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Nothing like a toasted marshmallow on the fire.
I think you got it toasted just about right.
I think it's good. We'll let this cool a little bit, and then you can have your middle part. Want me to blow on it for you?
Sure.
Ooh, nice and brown. There you go. Excellent. Time to get another.